extensively on these topics, and his work has contributed to our understanding of the complex relationship between religion and politics in India. Dr. Ahmad is currently teaching at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies as an associate professor. He is the associate editor of South Asian Studies, a journal of the British Association of South Asian Studies. His works include Muslim Political Discourse in Post-Colonial India, Monuments, Memory, Contestation, Siyasi Muslims, A Story of Political Islam in India, and Democratic Accommodations, Minorities in Contemporary India. His recent works include Companion to Indian Democracy, Resilience, Fragility, Ambivalence, Rethinking Muslim Personal Law, Issues, Debates and Reforms, and the most recent one is Allah Naam Ki Siyasat. Honest speaker is Dr. Soumyabrata Choudhary. He is a renowned scholar of media and cultural studies with a focus on the intersection of politics, technology, and society. He is an associate professor at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, JNU. He has authored Theatre Number Event, 3 studies on the relationship between sovereignty, power, and truth, and articles on ancient Greek liturgy, the staging of Ibsen, psychoanalysis, Nietzsche, Schiller, and Hegel. His book Ambedkar and Other Immortals, an untouchable research program, came out in 2018. His latest book is Now It's Come to Distances, Notes on Coronavirus and Shaheen Bagh, Association and Isolation. Now the last speaker of this session is Dr. Brahma Prakash. Dr. Prakash is currently an assistant professor at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, JNU. He is the recipient of the Dwight Conquergood Award of Performance Studies International in 2013. His area of specialization lies in theatre and performance theories, rites, rituals and festival studies, regional theatre and performance traditions, Chinese and non-Western aesthetics, Dalits and Adivasi cultural performances, Marxism and culture, marginalized cultural performances and oral histories. His works include Cultural Labor, Conceptualizing the Folk Performance in India, published by Oxford University Press in 2019. We are heartily grateful to our chair and speakers for agreeing to our invitation. Moving forward, I would like to hand over to Professor Harish Naraindas for carrying on with the further proceedings. Thank you.
Well, I've been pressed into service to play class monitor and keep time. So we have 120 minutes, we have 4 speakers, and the organizers told me that all of you all have 20 minutes each. But I think she negotiated with me and said it's 22 and a half. So that makes it exactly 90 minutes between the 4 of you all. And since all of you all have been sumptuously introduced, no further introductions are necessary. Let's start without further ado with Nivedita.
Thank you so much to JNU Academic for organizing this amazing conference and other conferences in the past. It's an entirely student-run initiative, entirely self-funded, and the hall is packed when vacations are ongoing. There are students from other universities here as well. So when we fight for something called the idea of JNU, we're not fighting for one university, we are fighting for the future of self-driven critical thinking. And I want to thank JNU Academic for making this possible. I'm going to take my 30 seconds of my extra 2.5 minutes to also make another off-the-cuff statement before I read my presentation, which has to do with the sense that I had that life is changed. Because my very first class as an MA student in this university, in the old campus in 1981 was with Professor Sudipto Kaviraj. And when he walked into the classroom, he fit every fantasy we had of the JNU professor. He was in a kurta pajama, he looked the way he looks. And he wrote with several times with a chalk on a blackboard. 30 years down the line, he presents a paper from his mobile phone. And I thought, you never step into the same river twice. So my presentation today is part of a book, and so because I've condensed a 20-minute presentation, I hope it's not all over the place, but I'm going to simply read out my presentation so that I can keep to time. So the title of my presentation is Translation as a Mode of Self-Making, Psychoanalysis from the Global South. Can't hear me? Is there a problem? Can you hear me? Okay, so this presentation will explore translation as a mode of self-making across the multiple contexts in which we live. Focusing on location in the global south enables us to understand that what we call India is not an exceptional space, but one that has continuous historical and contemporary links across the globe, and that many of the intellectual developments in India are actually running parallel to or continuing conversations simultaneously taking part in many other parts of the global south. It is important not to exceptionalize or homogenize the entity that we call India. With that caveat, however, given the theme of this conference and the brief time that we have, I will mainly focus on psychoanalysis in India. And I need to also make clear that an important task that we must engage in when thinking from the global south is to make visible internal voices of dissent and debate within the non-Western knowledge formations. The issues of heterogeneity, power, and dissent within the non-West / global south is actually an absence, it's not generally addressed by post-colonial or even decolonial thinking, whose objects of critique remain empire / coloniality. However, we will take seriously the heterogeneity and power relations internal to the South by way of looking at debates and contentions within. Now, the reason I'm interested in psychoanalysis from the global South, or in psychoanalysis at all as a political theorist, is because of all the forms of secular modern knowledge that entered societies of the global South. Psychoanalysis appears to have been the one most confidently owned by practitioners who translated and located it into their own contexts. Of course, a parallel process also carries on, which is the one more familiar to us, to the rest of the social sciences and humanities, that is of seeking to translate indigenous notions of self and other into terms legible to psychoanalytic theory as it emanates from the West. So both processes were carrying on. Psychoanalysis came to our societies in the early 20th century, as other modern European forms of knowledge did, as a secular science. What is interesting for the outsider to the field, however, someone like myself, looking at scholarship on how psychoanalysis entered and was received across many societies of the global South from the early 20th century onwards, is how practitioners and theorists, so we're talking about in the lifetime of Freud onwards, is how practitioners and theorists immediately draw its two key ideas, the roles of the unconscious and of myth in self-making, into the dense jiti of their own location. So this term jiti, I'm drawing from Mizoguchi Yuzo, who uses the term jiti to refer to the specific pasts of different societies. It's been translated as the base entity that conditions their present. So this will actually tie up with the discussions on time in the previous session, as well as, of course, many of the issues raised in the first session, which is that the present is located on a palimpsest of a kind of a dense undergrowth, and this dense undergrowth of history and culture shapes the present. This secular modern science of the self, with its claims to universality, in practice, however, is transformed by traversing these landscapes, as practicing psychoanalysts and psychotherapists in India, Egypt, Morocco, Japan, China, and other parts of the global South translate, read, and practice psychoanalysis through different languages, traditions, myths, and spiritual practices. The two key reasons for this difference between the way psychoanalysis enters the global South and the way it emerged in Europe, almost simultaneously, as I said, within the lifetime of Freud, I think the two key reasons for the difference is that the practitioners of the global South are able to immediately own it and translate it into their own terms. And the two key reasons for this difference are, one, the process of secularization that had, in a sense, disenchanted the public domain in Europe, banishing religion to the private, Now, this was not a complete or successful process, but it was a hegemonic one. This process had barely begun in these parts of the globe in the 20th century, and even today is contested at every stage. And the second feature that we see as different is that the emergence of the heterosexual nuclear family as the only legitimate kind of family in the North was a process that colonial regimes gradually inaugurated in the South over the 20th century. But again, this has not been a fully successful venture anywhere in the South or even among people of color in the North. Both these features meant that practicing psychoanalysts in the South encountered very different modes of self-formation than outlined by classical psychoanalysis in Europe. So what we find, so I'll give you one example, one non-Indian example now. For example, we find that, so what is happening is that there are direct questions to Freud himself. So for example, Kurosawa in Japan in the 1930s and 40s was one of the earliest psychoanalysts in Japan. He questioned the universality of the Oedipus complex, I'll come to Oedipus in a while, and developed another concept. He called it the Ajase complex, which drew on a Buddhist story. I won't go into that, but in which the primary relationship is the mother-son bond. And it is based on the idea of a prenatal hostility towards the mother, a rancor of hostility that predates birth. And this draws on the Buddhist idea of reincarnation. So in other words, he developed the idea of a complex, so this is one way of engaging with psychoanalysis, which is to say the idea of the unconscious and myth-making are crucial for us, but our unconscious and our myth-making are different, and therefore our concepts will be different. He actually sent a German translation of this paper to Freud, but he did not receive any kind of, well, he received a reply, but it was not engaged with. What we find in each of these different contexts is that psychoanalysis is adopted and adapted. So one of the features that we see is that psychoanalysis is adopted and adapted by the more dominant hegemonizing tradition within these societies. So the heterogeneity of the jiti that psychoanalysis enters is often lost to it. But today in the 21st century, that internal heterogeneity of the global South is also speaking up from within the heart of psychoanalysis itself. So what I'm suggesting is that there seem to be three significant processes at every location. One is the translation of psychoanalysis into location-specific contexts. The Ajase complex is one such example. The second is translation of the local self directly into Western psychoanalysis, which is your psychoanalyst trained in the classical mode, trying to find exactly the kinds of things that Freud found. But there's a third feature, which is internal clashes between hegemonic and counter-hegemonic traditions within these regions. So for example, in the Arab world, we find that Freud is very confidently translated into Arabic, straight from German. And then Arabic scholars hold that they have actually captured the ideas of Freud better, the direct translation into Arabic. So they don't use the idea of the ego, they translate psychoanalysis as ilm al-nafs. Nafs is the term that they prefer to use, which has a very different kind of history and a more dense location than ego. They also draw on the Sufi Ibn Arabi. So there's an idea of consciousness and spirituality. So you see, psychoanalysis, mainstream psychoanalysis in the Arab world is already very different from the way it's practiced in Europe. But in addition, what we find, so this third feature I was talking about, that there are internal clashes between hegemonic and counter-hegemonic traditions, is that there's also the emergence of traditional forms of healing, through dua and in shrines and so on. And psychoanalysis allies with Quran, scholars of the Quran, to say that is superstition. The dua and the kind of things that are happening in Sufi shrines, the freeing people from possession, all of that is then defined by psychoanalysis in alliance with Quranic scholars as superstitious. So this is modern, this is acceptable, even we can even draw on the Quran, but the other is. So what I'm trying to say, obviously I can only hint at many of these things, that there are at least these three processes that are going on. Now I'm going to just quickly, so they're going to be like, it's going to be a bit choppy. So I'm going to now just talk about the way Oedipus figures in this field. So let's begin with the famous statement by Freud that it is the fate of all of us perhaps to direct our first sexual impulse towards our mother and our first hatred and our first murderous wish against our father. So first let's look at the ways in which this simply does not work. How universal is this assumed parricidal desire? Because let's take India now, or what we call India, this landmass that has come to be called India. In this part of the world, the living myths involving gods who are still worshipped are very different. For instance, we know about Yayati's son Puru and Shantanu's son Devavrat, both of whom attained to full masculine subjectivity through sacrificing their youth and sexual desire for their fathers, and they're rewarded for it very powerfully, they become very powerful men. Puru took on the untimely old age that was cursed upon his father and in turn ascended the throne, though he was the youngest son. It was his lineage, of course, that produced the dynasty of the Pandavas and Kauravas. Devavrat, of course, took an oath of lifelong celibacy so that his father's desire for the beautiful Satyavati could be fulfilled. And he not only gave up the right to the throne himself, but promised there would never be any progeny of his who would challenge that throne. And Bhishma, of course, went on, he was given the name Bhishma, and he went on to become the revered patriarch of the Mahabharata. So in such a culture, to simply talk about Oedipal desire is already problematic. But interestingly, we find, that is, in other words, there is something else, and I'll come to what I think that something else is. There are similar legends and myths in many parts of the world, all of which get read through Oedipus. That's one strand. I've talked about the way psychoanalysis, and I'll come a little bit more to that, about how in the global south it's more confidently owned. But there's also that other strand which tries to match which social sciences are more familiar with. Was there feudalism in India? That kind of question. So I'm looking at the was there feudalism in India kind of question now through Oedipus for a moment. So the absence of Oedipus tales, and therefore often Oedipus complex, can also be seen as a lack. It's like a permanent prison you're in. If you don't have an Oedipus tale, it's a sign of repression, it's a lack, and it prevents this is what prevents the emergence of Indians into full maturity and modernity. It could be read like this. So a scholar like A.K. Ramanujan, he embarks on the project of finding what he calls Oedipus-like patterns in Indian myth and folklore, keeping Sophocles' Oedipus Rex as the model. And what happens is that the universality of this primal parricide and guilt is assumed to such an extent that Oedipus can be sought and found everywhere. So there's a volume I came across, for example, which is a search for Oedipus in global folklore. And it finds Oedipus everywhere. Albania, Hungary, Papua, in the early to the late 20th century. I'll tell you what's the problem with, they're not actually Oedipus stories. They are stories, different kinds of stories of incest. Father and son having sex. A mother having sex with her son unknowingly. Mother having sex with her son because she desires him. There are multiple kinds of stories of incest. And they all get put into a volume called Oedipus in Folklore. A.K. Ramanujan found what he calls 8 variants in India. There are 8 different unusual stories, but because his project is to not be found lacking in the proper maturity that an Oedipus story promises, he looks for these stories, he finds 8 variants, and in all the variants, as he himself points out, the protagonist is the woman. And he puts it like this: the men are pawns in the story of women's fate. Again, in many of the stories that the volume tells, the father is entirely absent or already dead, or the father kills the son so the parricide is not a theme at all. So it seems to me that Oedipus Rex of Sophocles and this whole obsession is actually one version of the preoccupation of human societies with incest, in which one could see many other themes being figured. For instance, I think one of the key themes is the gradual delegitimation of matrilineal societies and replacement by patrilineal. And such a process would not have been free of violence. There would have been a great deal of violence in the transformation, in this transformation. And the emergence of the incest taboo almost from the moment that incest is confronted as such, and the taboo comes into being for a variety of reasons, perhaps wider alliances, perhaps avoidance of familial conflict. But when read through the Freudian Oedipus template, all these complex narratives about incest that suggest historical changes and shifts are understood simply as either reversals of the original Oedipus story or as different versions of the original, so-called original Sophocles telling, although really many being oral tellings may be older than Sophocles's. Ramanujan's essay in this volume recounts and participates in the Oedipal interpretation by scholars such as Goldman of conflicts between Brahmin sages and Kshatriya rulers in the epics and in temple legends. The Brahmin is read as the father, the Kshatriya as the son in such interpretations, with the son losing these battles for supremacy. But to impute a trans-historical, primal, familial frame to a historical process in which one social group is establishing control over others through violence, alliance building, and hegemonizing narratives is the equivalent of understanding capitalist transformation in England in terms of Oedipal conflict. So that's one kind of way in which just 5 more minutes, 5 minutes, yes. So this is one kind of way in which one can look at psychoanalysis in the global south, which is where you try to match the original narrative and the real thing, as it were. But as I said, actually there are multiple ways in which it's owned and replayed. I gave you one example of the Ajase complex, but a significant development in the field, and now I look more closely, more at India, significant development in the field appears to be the claim that the South is not merely different, but the claim is that what is considered the specificity of the South may in fact be universalizable globally. So it's one thing to say that the universal doesn't fit us, and we are a special case. It's another thing to say we have some conceptual, I think Professor Kaviraj said that in the context of aesthetic theory, that there are some concepts that can be universalized in the other direction. So now the claim, and we find this in both in Japanese psychoanalysis and in Indian, that the specificity of the South may be universalizable globally, that something presented as a counter to Western notions of the self is not peculiar to that particular culture alone, but has more universal valence. So for example, there is this concept of amae, the Japanese concept of amae, which was first written by a Japanese psychiatrist called Takeo Doi, and amae roughly corresponds to dependency need or basking in another's indulgence. And this has a lot to do with the mother-child relationship as well. And the interesting trend here is that Japanese scholars have been for some time arguing that amae is not to be conflated with attachment or dependence. In other words, it's not a pathological feature, but it is, and it's not unique to Japanese culture. The claim is that this particular mode of being in which you seek a kind of oneness with the other and you seek another's indulgence is possibly universal, and you can find amae behaviors in parts of the global north as well. So the playful acts of childlike dependence in a romantic relationship, for example, that's the kind of thing they're talking about here. Similarly, from India, Anup Dhar reads Girindra Shekhar Bose's contribution and his correspondence with Freud as more than an argument for cultural relativism. He's saying more than Indian and European patients are different. Rather, as Anup Dhar put puts it, India is an analyst of the European obsession with the phallus and the Oedipal as the structuring principle of psychic constitution. So the way he puts it is India as the analyst rather than the analysand. That is, India performing analysis on Europe. So Anubdhar, whom many of us know, is part of a collective institutional project begun in 2009 at Ambedkar University, Delhi, in which psychoanalysis is not about psychological interiority and the confessional attitude of classical Freudian psychoanalysis, but about groups and community. So Hani Oberoi Bahali, who is also a key founder of the initiative, calls it psychosocial clinical studies. That is, the individual does not come alone to the clinic. The individual comes as an entangled mass of communal memory and traces. So she actually puts it like this, that the psychotherapist becomes a co-sufferer participant or a co-vulnerable expert. So psychoanalysis from the global south, rather than psychoanalysis in the global south, seeks to speak to such experiences located elsewhere than the south too, which do not fit into mainstream Western psychoanalytic and conceptual frameworks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The next speaker is Soumyabrata Choudhary.
Whatever, it doesn't matter. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Before I thank the organizers, and I'm feeling thankful, but before I do that, I want to just announce my title because there might be some curiosity or questions about it. The title is Modernity naive or mature? Do the non-dupes err? The non-dupes err is a citation, which I'll talk about in a moment. Now, I'm really very pleased to be here for this conference. It is, like Nivedita said, it's amazing to be here. Let me also join in this chorus of feeling honored to be speaking along with, in the presence of a person who was well, not my teacher in that specific sense, because I was not from the political science department, but who was one of the most admired and inspiring thinkers, public intellectuals within the university at that time, when we were students in the 80s and 90s. And I still remember in this very hall, Professor Shukti Kaviraj, after the events of 1989, up to probably 1992 in India, Babri Masjid, making several really decisive public interventions and really holding a kind of logical mirror to our warped selves. So I really feel honored to be doing this. But also in that spirit of recollecting those times, let me mention an incident which I think would be both interesting and relevant for our discussion today. It was in that seminar room next door, where the very well-known Marxist historian of the analytical tradition, Gary Cohen, was speaking, again around that time, late 80s, early 90s, on the concept of alienation, estrangement in Marx, and kind of in that wonderful analytical tradition, trying to make sense of that concept, both logically but also historically. So after Professor Cohen, Gary Cohen, finished his talk, I had a question, among several others. I had a question about the status of something like estrangement or alienation in Marx, early Marx, in the sense that all alienation takes place within specific conditions of early capitalism in Marx's case, but also the other kind of question, which is, how does alienation actually happen? Is alienation also something which happens in the sense of an event, in the sense of something that takes place, apart from it being possible in a certain set of alienating conditions in capitalist mode of production? Professor Cohen, Gary Cohen, was somewhat bewildered by the question in the first place. And then when I tried to explain myself by citing a certain example from a French philosopher, Gilles Deleuze, and also Felix Guattari, in that book was mentioned in the last session, Thousand Platters actually, where there's a chapter called Pragmatics of Postulates of Linguistics and Pragmatics of Any Concept, which not just proposes a concept, but shows how the concept works, particularly in the medium of speech, how concept actually gains a certain force in a speech act. When I tried to take some examples from Deleuze, I remember Professor Cohen for a moment stopping and then saying, "Oh, that's French." You know, they make simple things difficult. Well, I mean, it was disappointing because I did say that, well, I have no stakes in whether it is French in its origin or, you know, English because he's an English, he was an English historian. I have no stakes in that division, you know, in that division of identities. But for him, that was the last word. Well, that's French. And I was set to think about it, what exactly was going on when he sort of stopped the exchange, the interlocution, as it were, with that specific name, French. And of course, the context is obviously interesting and ironic because this is not happening, let's say, between Europe or West and the non-West. This is happening as a kind of within the province itself. But more theoretically, since you're concerned with some sort of a stakes of theory here, what is really, what I thought about as we went along, and I was strangely led to think about it again after so many, many years, thanks to this invitation, is that the name French acted, it could act in three ways. The first is that when you use a name, any name, French, English, Indian, doesn't matter, any name, it kind of empties out all content. You know, so once you take a name, then the name is the only reality that remains, which is called in philosophy nominalism, a kind of nominalist emptying out, hollowing out of all heterogeneity, of all complexity, of all contradiction. That's one function. The other function, interestingly, is that a name totalizes. So when you say French, or Indian, or whatever, European, then what it does is it saturates the reality. So you can't say Indian and then say, oh, but I mean it in this specific way. You have to then add qualifiers. Otherwise, any name totalizes in the sense of a proper name. Though the exact elements or the set which it refers to might not be so clear, but it saturates and totalizes. So these are at least two ways, analytically, that one can think of how a name functions. And when you say French, then the name French completely is emptied out, and at the most you can you can sort of imagine that Professor Cohen, Gary Cohen is saying that the French have a kind of style which doesn't agree with me. You know, it's a kind of subjective trace, which is French, a kind of identifying trait, but only indexical. It is not really a content. Or it means that all of France is something that is alien to me. That's not my message. He probably didn't mean the latter at all. But there is a third way of looking at the name, and that is what interests me, which has a greater, which lends itself to a greater process of what a philosopher Sylvain Lazarus calls thinkability. That is what I want to briefly examine with your help, the thinkability of concepts before we come to a theoretical object. In this case, the object being modernity. So, with a name, one of the ways that we can think of thinkability is, let me quickly go now to again a reference in the historical context of post-colonial thinking and debates, which is a debate that took place with Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak's very well-known seminal essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? Again, in the, after the 1970s, after the translation of grammatology, Derrida's grammatology, this was probably, arguably, the next most important thing that she wrote, in which she did several things. We don't have the time to go into the details. I'm really helped here by the brilliant reading of Spivak by Naraindas Choudhary's post-deconstructive subjectivity and post-colonial theory, in what I say. But very briefly, in the several things that Spivak did, she was also reading against two very well-known European thinkers from that time, Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze, who had a conversation, a dialogue, which is called Intellectuals and Power, and Spivak's intervention was a critique of that dialogue of Deleuze and Foucault, Intellectuals and Power, where she, against Deleuze and Foucault, who were speaking of what they called the desire of the workers. They were using a kind of what Spivak would call a monolithic sort of a name again, the workers. And they used the attribute of the desire of workers as something which they differentiated from what they themselves called the interests of workers. But they did not say European worker or, the migrant worker. And the name worker, again, as a name, was posited or posed at the most general level. So they spoke of the worker struggle as a struggle with an orientation of desire rather than merely interests. Against that particular organ, which is a prime, violent, repressive apparatus of desire, which is the state. And of course, this is taking place in a kind of post-68, post-Maoist context in France, in which Deleuze and Guattari said, this desire cannot be represented. And who can't represent it? Clearly, the two main organs of representation. One, the intellectual, and two, connected to that, the organization. Both clearly very strongly anchored in a certain Marxist theoretical history, to which they opposed these two sort of articulated terms, desire and what they call concrete experience. In her critique, Gayatri Spivak opposes to Deleuze Guattari's invocation of experience and something like desire, a very subtle and a very singular kind of a reading of Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, in which she, very interestingly, accuses Deleuze and Guattari, not Guattari here, Deleuze and Foucault, of a certain naivete when they speak of desire without really analytically and critically investigating the conditions of any worker struggle which lie in the international division of labor, which obviously cannot be separated from the experience of colonialism and imperialism. So in those conditions, at a certain moment, while analyzing in a very sort of recommendation of Marx's salutary analysis of 18th century, 19th century French history, up to the 1848 revolution, 18th Brumaire, Marx differentiates between a descriptive understanding of a class and what is famously in Marx's vocabulary called class consciousness. And she says and she interprets Marx to be saying, between class consciousness and class as a descriptive category, there is a critical and a kind of incommensurable gap, and with a particular content or a particular reference, which is a descriptive understanding of class. But what she calls, and she says this in her own vocabulary, in contemporary language, this could be called a performative understanding of a class. So the third perspective of the name is performative. So probably Gary Cohen, when he was, with a certain kind of, probably, impatience, just saying this is too French. What he was probably saying was, well, the French are not just either content or a simple nominal, just a name, but they are a particular mode of effectuating thinking which does not agree with me. So it is this mode of effectuating thinking that becomes the real question in theory and any theoretical object, whether it be modernity or anything else. Now, in that particular context, it is interesting to see that with this particular allegation that Spivak makes against Deleuze and Foucault, that they are being naive when they speak of desire, she's clearly saying that they're being, well, European. She does not quite say Eurocentric. She's simply saying that this is a kind of European naivete because it is a naivete which comes from a particular kind of, well, if you want, a mode of European historical politics, which is a modern naivete. And what is that modern naivete? Well, she does not say it, but we can extend this discussion by taking two quick examples from two monumental figures from European history of thinking about modernity from 18th to 20th centuries. On the one hand, you have Immanuel Kant, who famously announced that the age of enlightenment is a kind of threshold of the maturity of mankind. Now, he did, to do justice to Kant, he did not say we are enlightened. He said we live in an age of enlightenment. So even this maturity is only a horizon. But even that horizon clearly is something to which the Europeans are closer, than the non-Europeans. This clearly comes from a colonial imperialist silent context in Kant. But if you go further in the 20th century, in again a classic by Hannah Arendt on revolution, Arendt says that this is an age of revolutions. There are revolutions before the modern age. But the modern age is the paradigm of modernity is revolution, which means a certain kind of rupture. But what is that rupture? The rupture is not simply an empirical rupture. The rupture is a kind of constituent potentiality, a potentiality for something new. She uses the interesting term in the European languages, natality, a kind of newness of births. This is, well, a kind of affirmative naivete, that Europe is capable of a kind of affirmative naivete, that from a very naive but strangely universal position, we can now create a completely new set of conditions for human life. So it is a very interesting and paradoxical claim for modernity, which is both at a threshold of maturity in which the Europeans are closer to the horizon of their universal, maturity, but also the Europeans have a kind of constituent newness which is denied the non-Europeans. This becomes the matrix of a certain kind of, before a Eurocentrism, through Spivak, what I would call, and I think Spivak has said this herself, a certain kind of what I will call Europeanism. And only someone like Spivak, not as an individual, but someone in her position, could perform such a task of Europeanism at a distance. And this is the condition for any further thinking of the critique of this very Europeanism, insofar as you're both articulating the name Europe and giving it both what Spivak in a somewhat specialized literary rhetoric language calls a catachrestic subject. Catachrestic basically means in rhetoric a name which is exaggerated with nothing of its literal referent left. A name which carries a certain kind of autonomous intensity. So on the one hand, a name becomes almost like a certain kind of fetish. It becomes an occasion of enjoyment. So, I mean, let's face it, when we talk about Indian political theory, someone is having a good time. Oh yeah. Yeah, it is, there is a state of enjoyment. Yeah, and why not? So that's one side, a kind of catachrestic exaggeration. On the other side, there's also what, in very responsible and very subtle reading, can the subaltern speak, Gayatri Spivak speaks of the conditions of a particular, well, not really territorially divided social reality, but a kind of impure social reality, which is post-colonial social reality. And there she speaks in terms of hegemony. She says what doesn't Foucault miss is the pertinence of an analysis of hegemony. Because hegemony cannot afford to be naive. All hegemony is based on, again, a very interesting paradox of a certain formal condition of the equality of all the hegemonic actors, but at the same time on a real condition of inequality. So hegemony is always articulated with counter-hegemony, and this cannot be in any way grounded. 3 minutes, all right. Grounded on any kind of assumption of an affirmative naivete. So this, to me, was a singular intervention and pioneering intervention that Gayatri Spivak made at that time. And in a way, it was an occasion to go back to reading that text, and thanks to the organizers for that. And thanks to Aniruddha for teaching me how to read this interesting text and difficult text. But you see, it is interesting that within a few years, when Spivak writes about what is a text called Scattered Speculations on Subalternity and so on, she very interestingly changes the vocabulary about the subaltern. And she speaks of the subaltern as, well, of course, the subaltern is at the margins, a kind of heterogeneous margin. But here she speaks in specifically Deleuze's language when she speaks of the subaltern as singular. Not anymore not anymore merely at the margins, but something which is singular to the field itself, and that's incommensurable, in a kind of radical sense. Something not quite included in the conditions of hegemony, not entirely. Something left out of the hegemonic game of hegemony and counter-hegemony. And this singular evocation of the subaltern, interestingly to me, in a way brings back the question of a certain affirmative naivete, which is the affirmative naivete which, in Deleuze and Foucault's language, admittedly Europeanist and to that extent Eurocentric, nevertheless has something as a gamble, as a wager, something more than merely knowledge at its heart, something which is thought without a sufficient object of reference or object of knowledge, which they call it desire. Now, at the very end, let me quickly take an example from, and it is a big jump, of course, pardon me for that, but I think the example will vindicate my move, and I'll end with that. So just a minute, okay? Which is an example from B.R. Ambedkar. And there are several texts which we could go to, but the one that is most easily sort of accessible here in the light of this discussion is the following. It is a speech that B.R. Ambedkar made in March 1927 in Marathi, in Mahar, famously, in which, in English translation, it reads, or he says, that what we're doing at Mahar, which is, as we all know, act of transgression of drinking from the Chavada tank, which was prohibited to the Mahar untouchable caste, and untouchable caste in general, the Mahars were leading this particular, transgressive Satyagraha, as they call it. Anyway, so he says, probably this is the first time. So he says three things. First, that don't think that we have come here to drink the water from the Chavada tank. We have been living well enough without drinking their water. Don't think it will make us immortal. Why does he say that? Clearly he's referring to the pretensions of holy water, Ganga. Don't think we are trying to replicate some kind of purification of drinking, or the Ganga water through drinking from the Chavada tank. It's contemptuous toward that whole theology of purity. And yet we're doing it. And he says for another reason. And that is that the second move, he says we're doing it to announce a norm of equality, probably for the first time in Indian history. Now clearly this is not a philological claim. It is a naive claim. But it's a naive claim with an affirmative force, with an performative force. Because anyone can argue, oh, there are other texts, other conjunctures in Indian history where equality has been, asserted. Nevertheless, Ambedkar makes a naive affirmative claim. But then it is a third thing with which I end. He says, if we were to look for a measure to measure this moment with in Mahar, we have to probably go to the French Revolution. Now, easily you could say, and that would be an easy and bad interpretation, to say this is, in a sense, a kind of a colonial measure. No. In Ambedkar, it seems to me, this is a measure which is a measure of a kind of free, naive, and yet egalitarian measure of the French Revolution at a distance. Because at a distance, the measure both measures Mahar, and yet strangely, precisely because it's European, it doesn't interfere with Mahar. It doesn't mix up the stakes of Mahar. Because as a claim of equality, it remains localized to the contestations of Indian history. And yet as a measure, which means as a measure which creates a kind of, in a certain vocabulary, evental measure. As an event, it gains a particular kind of eternity or immortality. For which, again, you need a historical measure. He, for his strategic reasons, chooses it for the French Revolution. In this sense, the French Revolution makes, this choosing of the measure of French Revolution makes Ambedkar another example of a Eurocentric, a Europeanist without being in the least, without a trace of Eurocentrism. So these were some methodological and meta-theoretical and nominalist points I wanted to make. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, JNU Academic. Thank you very much, JNU Academics, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share my work. I would like to begin with a confusion and a nervousness. I am nervous because I am not from JNU. Because all previous speakers, they came and they celebrated their JNU association. I don't have any association, any formal association with JNU. Yet, two of my most influential teachers are from JNU, Professor Thakur and Professor Kaviraj. So, I do share JNU-ness in some sense. So, this is the nervousness. So, and now the confusion. The confusion is about what am I doing here? Because formally I work on Indian politics and Muslim politics. And this seminar is on the future of political theory, and specifically this particular session is on Indian modernity. So I was a bit confused what to do. And then I thought a lot, and I realized that I am here because I was identified for two of my basic core identities or identity attributes, my Muslimness and my identity as a researcher. So I thought that I should write something on that, my Muslimness and the way I take that Muslimness in order to perform an active role as a researcher. So this note is about all that. So it is written in a bit of a biographical sort of thing, because like Gandhi, I am not Gandhi. I feel that I am also an object in some senses. The recent protest, because this article was written when NPCA protests were going on. The recent protest against the Citizenship Amendment Act, a law passed by the Indian Parliament that offers citizenship to non-Muslim religious communities of 3 Muslim majority states, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Afghanistan, have posed a serious intellectual dilemma for researchers and academics like me. A section of protesters argue, in fact quite stridently, that Muslims including scholars and academics with Muslim names, should come forward and reclaim their Muslim identity as affected minority. Arina Akbar, for instance, wrote a newspaper article and she said, and I quote, "If Muslims are asserting their religious identity with their religious slogans, it is because they have been targeted on account of their religion. If the state wants to bully me because of my faith, I will only publicly assert it." Hannah Arendt, the Jewish political philosopher who fled Nazi Germany in 1930s, wrote, and this is the quote she wrote in her article, "If one is attacked as a Jew, one must defend oneself as a Jew, not as German, not as world citizen, not as upholder of the right of man. A democracy allows you to protest from your standpoint. An affected majority can protest solely as an Indian. An affected minority has the right to protest as an Indian and as a minority," unquote. This is not my quote, so don't get confused. The argument of this kind, and this is me, led to a short-lived yet highly controversial debate. It began in January 2020 when the anti-CA protesters were going on throughout the country, and Delhi's Shaheen Bagh had emerged as the epicenter of this new politics of resistance. A prominent Bharatiya Janata Party leader shared a video clip of a speech delivered by your JNU student, Sharjeel Imam. The police took swift action and Sharjeel Imam was arrested under National Security Act. The pro-BJP media described Sharjeel Imam as the mastermind of the anti-CA protest. The organizer, the mouthpiece of RSS, they don't own it now, by the way, published a detailed cover story on the separatist and anti-national politics of Imam in its February 2020 print edition. The anti-CA protesters were somehow confused on this question. There were two rather conflicting responses. The organizers of the Shaheen Bagh protest took a very clear position. In order to provide an inclusive character to the anti-CA protests, the Shaheen Bagh committee issued a statement asserting that no one individual's video, statement, or article can represent the movement, unquote. On the other hand, a section of protesters supported Sharjeel Imam's freedom of expression. Some of them, in fact, recognized him as the voice of young Indian Muslims. I did not intervene in this debate directly, though I had written a few articles in newspaper and my portal on the overtly communal nature of CEA. I was not in India at that time and did not have sufficient information to make any substantive comment or argument on this episode. Nevertheless, I gave an interview to NDTV underlining the nature of BJP's CAA politics and its keenness to appropriate the figure of Sharjeel Imam for transforming the CAA protest into a Hindu-Muslim conflict. I also made it clear that although I was not fully aware of the content of Imam's controversial speech, I found his views objectionable and counterproductive. This minor comment was taken very seriously by the pro-Imam intellectuals and activists. I was criticized for being passive, inactive, self-contented, armchair, liberal secular intellectual who would not dare to speak as a Muslim. Pani pi leta hoon. My professional affiliations were also invoked to describe me as intellectual elite who would intentionally make an unclear, tentative, less political critique of the CA in the name of nuanced analysis. I do not respond to such allegations. I find them extremely essentialist, polemical, intellectually inadequate, and politically rhetorical in nature. This type of criticism is deeply rooted in the intellectual universe of Indian academics and public life. However, I do not underestimate a serious intellectual question that emerges from these criticisms. Do I need to speak only as a Muslim? If yes, how should I deal with my professional identity as a researcher? If no, how to justify my deep cultural philosophical association with the version of Islam I recognize as my religion. This short note is a modest attempt to unpack this poser. I have divided it into three parts, but because we have only 22 minutes, so I will only speak only on the first part of it, and then in the question answer session we can come back to that. In the first part, I raise a few conceptual methodological questions, especially in relation to my ongoing research on the politics of Muslim political representation in post-colonial India. Through these questions, I make an attempt to share my own anxieties and the problems that I encountered while engaging with the issues of Muslim identity. In the second part of the note, I discuss the methodological moves which I take or intend to take to deal with these identified questions. These moves are primarily organized as self-clarifications and self-criticism, and I do not wish to present them in an instructive way. In the final part of this note, I make a broad argument on what I call intellectual politics. The first part. The conceptual political category called Indian Muslims poses the first kind of challenge. Muslimness of an individual or a group as a lived experience, and the Muslim identity of a social cultural group as an object of analysis introduce us to two very different formulations. A Muslim who lives in India may accommodate various social, cultural, linguistic, and even religious affiliation as lived experiences without classifying them either as Indian or Islamic. However, when such lived experiences are transformed into object of analysis, the notion of identity or identities emerge as conceptual tools by which we try to make sense of the multifaceted cultural engagement and religious ideological commitment of an individual or a group. Thus, a number of groups and communities who live in different regions of India and in fact practice various forms of Islam invariably become Indian Muslims. The legal constitutional discourse in India, which recognizes Muslim as a religious minority, is another important source that provides a legal homogeneity to this pan-Indian identity of Muslims. The Indian Muslims are to be recognized not merely as individual citizens, but also as members of a nationally recognized religious minority. This legal duality, secular citizenship versus minority rights of a religious community, has been one of the most contentious aspects of post-colonial Indian politics. Indian Muslims are often called a pampered community, and the minority rights given to them are described as a symbol of Muslim appeasement by the Hindu rights. It does not, however, mean that the Muslim individual groups do not assert their collective Islamic identity. They prefer to describe themselves as Muslim in a variety of ways. These diverse expressions of Muslimness introduce us to ever-changing collective self-perception of Muslim social group and their imagined meaning of Islamic Ummah in the Indian context. The Indian Muslim identity in this sense is not something that we merely discover through our research on concerned Muslim communities, but rather it has a cultural, sociological career of its own. The Muslim identity of a researcher is another aspect of this Muslim identity process. The Muslim identity of a researcher helps the researcher to use his or her own experiences as a Muslim in formatting the appropriate questions for responding. His or her cultural location also gives him or her an unprecedented access to what may be called the innermost domain of the concerned Muslim communities. However, the Muslim identity of a researcher has its own limitation. Many a time, it becomes very difficult to draw a clear dividing line between the research questions and the cultural practices and affiliations which one shares with the community or the group he or she belongs to. This becomes more complicated when Muslim researchers are asked to respond as some kind of representative of concerned Muslim communities. In such cases, the professional ethics of research is somehow ignored and the thin dividing line between research and praxis is disregarded. Thus, as a researcher of Muslim identity, I encounter three overlapping formulations. One, there is a difference between identities as lived experiences and identities as object of analysis. B, second, the objectification of identities could have many forms. Thus, there is a difference between the constitution of identities in the public and political discourses and the study of identities in academic discourses. 3. The identity of a researcher is an important aspect which should not be taken as given, especially while doing social and political analysis. I think I should stop here. I have time. Okay, so I skipped 4 minutes. Okay, let me conclude by reading out a passage of this paper. And this is with regard to if these questions pose a certain kind of a problem for a Muslim researcher doing work on Muslims, then Peter D'Souza made an interesting argument with regard to public intellectualism, the nature of intellectual work. He says the public intellectual has to carry both the persona of the autonomous intellectual and the advocate of social cause equally within himself or herself, sometimes allowing the one to dominate, sometimes the other. It is a tipping point that will determine when one yields to when one recognizes in the political context the need for a particular persona to be in the foreground. Unquote. This idea of tipping point, in my view, needs to be elaborated. I find 3 possible expressions of it. First, we must distance ourselves from the people or communities we research on. This creative critical distancing is important because as researchers, we are always in a privileged position. Our research output often gives us public visibility. We also have access to different sets of information which are not easily available to communities or participants we work on. Our academic profession rather, it is an outcome of his or her analytical investment in the subject of research. Thus, one must spell out the nature of these interpretive schemes for the sake of intellectual transparency. Finally, the nature of argument and conclusion we draw from our that intellectual or academic arguments are delicate, tentative, and open-ended, while the political argument or positions are concrete and inflexible. This distinction is superficial and unhelpful. Deep engagement with any phenomena, intellectual or political, is bound to produce argumentative openness. Gandhi's reference of his political inconsistencies, for example, underline the context-specific nature of his intellectual argument. A researcher, therefore, is expected to produce intellectually informed and politically driven argument in such a manner that his or her reader may be able to draw their own political meanings. This brings us to the question that Alina Akbar poses to me. A Muslim must speak as a Muslim. As a Muslim researcher, my answer is simple. I do not want to give up my identity as a Muslim, yet at the same time, I do not want to speak only as a Muslim. I practice an intellectual politics that encourages me to take a political position without compromising with the established protocol, procedures, and ethics of my profession as an academic. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so thank you so much, JNU Academy, for giving me this opportunity. मैं तो पानी पीते ही रहूँगा इतना भी देखकर. Yeah, so of course, like many of our teachers have become legends. I study on I do research on folklore, and I think the name Subrito Kaviraj appears in folklore of JNU. So that way, I don't have that kind of interaction. I have not read him that much, but yes, there are many teachers who appears as a part of those legends, and he is one of them. So obviously. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about maybe something different, but of course, on the many, I think Nivedita has touched upon this question of individuality, and that how that individuality appears in the kinds of cultural context of India. So the title is called Beyond the Autonomy of an Artwork, Aesthetic Problem of Indian Modernity. So I'm trying to take these kinds of aesthetic reading of Indian modernity and how it raises some kinds of challenges, but it also opens up new kinds of possibilities. For some time, I've been working on the idea of indignity and dignity of artwork and artists, and the question of marginality in Indian aesthetics, with the question of cultural justice. So this has been some of the questions that I've been working on, how some of the art forms becomes getting marginalized, somehow especially I work on the field of folk performances. And one of the perennial questions that I have been asking for some years that how aesthetic regime creates certain kinds of hierarchy in which these kinds of performance gets marginalized. And it's a lot to do with the kinds of question of dignity, indignity, the question of caste that we can think about. So in this paper, I'm going to share some of my reflections, which I would like to term as an aesthetics problem of Indian modernity. In my view, some of the problems raised in the generalized idea of autonomy and individuality, two key principles of modernity. In my view, the key principles, instead of creating a spaces of equality and cultural justice to artwork and artists coming from marginalized community, reproduce the hierarchy in which they get further marginalized. Drawing on the words of Agnes Taylor's philosophers and her work on aesthetics and modernity, and Sarath Patil's work on aesthetic conflict, this paper delves into the problem of Indian modernity and its relation to art. It includes the question of diverse communities, question of leisure, that how many times when we think about art, we think that art only happens in leisure time. And I think Sarath Patil provides one of the very complex definition kinds of understanding, that how we are taking these kinds of understanding, that the art only happens in leisure time, then you are trying to create certain kinds of hierarchy already, and you are not able to recognize certain kinds of artistic and cultural production. So I largely draw from Agnes Taylor's argument, where she says that the dignity of humankind, of person, is somehow related to the dignity of artwork. And this is precisely happening in Indian context, because it is not just we are discussing about marginalized artists, because many times they are marginalized because the art form itself is marginalized. And both relations has to be seen in a kinds of correlation, and that is the connection I am trying to find out here. So it could be said that artworks no longer exist because where there is no human dignity. So the third thing is, one, that we need to think this relationship between artist and artwork, and second, that is larger humanitarian kinds of discourse. If you don't have human dignity, then neither the artist will have dignity nor the artwork will have dignity. So it has been some of the literature issue, and so it has been part of the certain kinds of idea of cultural justice, theorizing cultural justice that I have been trying to develop here. And you have very interesting kinds of criticism that has been provided on this whole idea of the Indian modernism by Santosh Sadanandan and by S. Aloni, who clearly said that Sadanandan clearly argued that how modernism in Indian art is defined through the rubric of elite practitioners and its in relation to the hegemony of Western dominance. And I am not going into those kinds of details. But at the same time, because many times when we discuss about this question of modernity in Indian theatre, then it becomes modern theatre. And largely it becomes urban kinds of phenomena in which this idea of the modernity gets defined. So whatever is urban becomes modern, and whatever you have outside the urban, that becomes a peripheral, rural kinds of understanding. So now the question we can ask that whether Jyotiba Phule's Povara was a modernist intervention or a non-modernist intervention, because Povara as a form comes from very traditional kinds of form, but again makes a certain kinds of modern consciousness. Same way we can also ask, we have a very popular theatre personality from Bihar, Vikhai Thakur, who himself comes from migrant laborers background, but he did two remarkable plays, and that I consider a very modernist kind of intervention. One play is called Robert Hicho, and another play is called Beti Bechwa, Seller of the Daughter, where he is criticizing his practice of selling of the daughter among the marginalized communities. We have some clear examples where Hilal Ahmad has clearly made these kinds of remarks in relation to Kabir, Ravidas, and others other Persian poets where she is saying that they were the early modernists. They were creating certain kinds of consciousness, they were creating certain kinds of sensibility that can be really certain kinds of modernist kinds of understanding. So now I would like to come to this question of autonomy, how autonomy is creating problem, but also opening up certain kinds of new kinds of spaces. अभी तो बात होती है ना जब हमारी यूनिवर्सिटी में बात होती है तो बोलते हैं कि autonomy चाहिए क्या देते क्या तो how this would discourse of autonomy, and I think that the question that we are discussing many times this question of autonomy becomes